Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Tractor Designs. Now, if you've watched a lot of this channel, you know there's one thing we love bloody doing here on Tractor Designs, that is talking about tractors. We love the things. I've devoted a lot of my career to learning about steam tractors. Just kidding. I really don't know much, if anything at all, about steam tractors. If you're a new viewer to this channel, you might be a little bit confused. Let me explain myself. So last year I put up this post as a joke, and it was April Fool's, as it is today, right now. And I thought it would be funny, and a lot of you seemed to like it and were a little bit disappointed that I wasn't doing something on tractors. So a year later to the day, I thought we would bite the bullet and do something steam tractor related. So today, Oceanliner Designs does become Tractor Designs. Like I said, there's only one problem with that. I don't personally know a lot about steam tractors, but fortunately, I just so happen to know somebody who does.
Hello there. Rainhill 1829. I am a tractor restorer and operator out of Alberta, Canada. And for the last 17 years, I have been showing people on the internet just what we're up to, keeping these machines running, keeping them operating. And yeah, that's what we do.
Look, there's a lot of crossover between steam tractors and oceanliners, believe it or not. The world before the Oceanliner was harsh. It was really difficult to get across the globe. You were really putting your life in somebody else's hands. That's what this channel's really all about, talking about that incredible period of development in the 19th century as the Oceanliner, the steamship, arrived and changed everything. The tractor had a similar impact.
For thousands of years before mechanization, farming was basically existed in a stagnant form. The tools used were largely hand and horse or other beast driven, and the amount of ground that you could cover in a day really didn't change for hundreds and hundreds of years. And it was only with the advent of steam-driven mechanization that things really started to change rapidly. Like in the space of less than a generation, you went from farming at an acre a day with a plow to being able to cover 40 or more. And something like that had never happened. And that's just how truly revolutionary the machine was. And each one built upon the previous one. They got faster, they got more powerful, they required less maintenance and less people to run them. And in the space of less than 100 years, we went from muscle power to machines that could cover entire several hundred acres at a time with, minimal effort and minimal manpower.
What did that mean for, crop growth and the world economy? Because obviously, I think of this from the ship perspective. It's nice you've got a ship in the background there. Is that a Russian cruiser? What is that?
It is, yeah, very, very good. That's the Varyag. Yeah.
Very cool. We love to see it. I think of it in the context of ships, and there's no doubt, the Industrial Revolution obviously completely changed shipping, and it meant trade around the world could double and quintuple and so on. Conversely, on land, what does it mean when you go from 40 times, 40 times and more land that you could cover? What does that do for crops and for the economy?
This triggered an exponential growth in the amount of farmland that was being utilized all over the world. And this especially was realized in the opening up of the Americas. The United States and Canada went from hand-worked agrarian methods to mechanization as the land was being broken for the very first time. Fields in Europe had been worked for hundreds, sometimes thousands of years, and they saw mechanization in the same way that the Americas did, but for the Americas, these lands were being opened up for the very first time, and the fields that a single farmer could plant and harvest were orders of magnitude larger than what was known in Europe. So what was previously a 4 or 5 acre field to a single farming family, you could now parcel it up in quarter sections, which were 160 acres at a time. and hand those off to farms, and they could successfully farm them in a single season with time to spare. That's kind of the massive jump that these machines allowed to happen.
Well, tell us a little bit about the first ones. I mean, where did it all begin?
So it all, if we rewind all the way back to the very first machine that worked mechanically on its own, we could probably trace that back to 1770 in France. Nicholas Joseph Cugnot built what is considered to be the first mechanical machine to move on its own. It was an artillery tractor that he worked on in 1769. He built a working model, and upon that success, he built an artillery tractor in full size. It wasn't particularly successful, but it was a sign of things to come. It worked basically on a ratcheting mechanism, and it was able to crawl along at just over 2 miles an hour. It was supposed to carry 4 tons of weight. It didn't. It ended up carrying only about 300 weights, which was basically a couple barrels of bourbon.
Right.
So not exactly the cannon tubes that it was supposed to be, but it was a sign of things to come. And really from there on is that's where sort of the innovative gears started turning, mostly in railway, but also on things that moved about on the ground.
Were there any other kind of wacky design iterations that came about? Obviously, getting from concept to the finished thing takes a lot of planning and years of refinement. I mean, how long did it take until basically we got to like the steam tractor as we know it today, and where it's formed and changed for a very long time? And what are some of like the oddities that maybe popped up along the way?
So the machine that we typically associate with being the quintessential steam traction engine or steam road engine basically achieved its final form right about in the 1860s, 1870s. And that was horizontal boiler, 2 axles, engine typically on top, sometimes undermounted, drive to the rear wheels, steer wheels on the front, operators sitting in the back as they would typically with a locomotive. And anything before that, there were outliers where the machine did resemble a modern steam tractor beforehand, but largely the design didn't fully materialize as we know it today until about the 1860s, 1870s, depending on the country. Previous to that, there were a lot of designs that were very strange because just like with any emergent technology, there is no rule book, so a lot of inventors just put the pieces together and it did not matter what it looked like, it just had to work. And some of them did work, some of them didn't.
What are some of your favorites from that time? What stands out in your mind?
In 1832, a fellow named John Heathcote built a steam plowing engine that used cables to draw a plow back and forth across a field, a winding engine as we know them today. What set his apart was that it was built within a massive caterpillar track that sat dozens of feet high, and this was actually the very first instance of caterpillar tracks, or as caterpillar tracks as we know them today, being used in a machine. It was the very first appearance, and it worked reasonably well until it sank into a swamp, and that was the end of the experiment, but it did work for several years. The Derby broadside tractor was a design, it was developed in 1879 by Thomas Darby of Essex, and it was a horizontal steam boiler, but instead of having wheels like your typical steam road engine or traction engine would have, it had legs. Depending on which of the early models we're talking about, it either had 6 or 8 legs, and the legs were essentially plow shovels or plow shears that allowed the machine to scuttle sideways, much like a crab. And as it scuttled along, it would actually plow the ground. The problem with this design was it was extremely wide, and it made road transport very cumbersome. And later designs included wheels that actually allowed them to sort of move between fields, but the early ones You just had to figure out a way to get it from field to field without destroying the road, and whether that meant laying down stones or wood corduroy, who knows. But it was actually a reasonably successful design. They built several iterations of, and Darby eventually built units that would hook onto the back of other steam tractors and could be used as a tow-behind implement. And he built them well into the 1900s. So this is a company that actually had some staying power, and it actually turned out to be quite a reasonably successful design despite its ridiculous look.
What was the 19th century's, like in firearms, there was the Winchester 1873, you know what I mean? And that typified rifles from then on. And the Campania, that was like, that set the tone for Oceanliners from then on. What was like the steam tractor of the 19th century? You said it happened around about the 1860s. That was the one by which all others were based on.
In Europe, it could be argued that one of the more successful emergent designs was some of the designs built by Fowler and Sons of Leeds. They experimented early on with a particular machine known as the steeplechaser. It had a massive rear wheel. Some sources say 12 feet in diameter, some say 14. And they experimented with this machine and learned fairly early on that one of the best ways to operate a machine of that weight on soft ground is to use the largest diameter wheel possible, because that gives you a lot of ground contact. Unfortunately for the steeplechaser, it was too big. It made the machine cumbersome, and it tended to wobble quite a bit even on slightly rough ground. But using the lessons they learned, Fowler started building a machine known as the 9-footer, and while that one never went into production, it did give them the lessons that they needed to start building machines that became ubiquitous all over the UK and into Europe as well, that had 7-foot diameter rear wheels. And that's kind of where we saw the emergence of the most standard looking of traction engines and road engines in Europe. As for the Americas, for better or for worse, it was the J.I. Case tractor. They outbuilt their competition 10-1 because their machine was simple and cheap. They didn't put any flourishes on their machines. They didn't use any methods that were particularly groundbreaking, but their machine was easy to maintain, easy to manufacture. You could operate it anywhere in the most terrible of conditions, and for that reason, farmers tended to gravitate towards it, because you had a machine that, even though it wasn't particularly flashy or anything like that, it was going to get the job done. And that's why there are so many Cases around today, because of all the American manufacturers, Case tended to outbuild its competition by a massive margin. One of the more fascinating ones was an engine known as the Box patent, and it was developed in the UK by William Box in 1876, and it resembled what we know today as your typical English road engine, and it typified that in every single way except for one, and that was its final drive system. Instead of using gears, it used side rods, just like a steam locomotive. And the reasoning behind this is because he wanted to develop a well-sprung back axle that allowed the machine to ride over rough terrain without causing the gears to come out of mesh, which was a problem if you had more than 1 or 2 inches of any sort of suspension play on the back of your road engine. And this machine, despite its strange appearance, was actually extremely successful, and a number of them worked well into the 20th century. The very first model that William produced, in its 20-year lifespan, actually hauled more than 30,000 miles, which is quite impressive for a machine like that. It typically ran with anywhere from 15 to 25 tons of cargo at any one time, being a road engine. It was a 2-speed unit, So they moved along pretty good. An interesting side note is William Box, unfortunately, was one of the unfortunate inventors who was killed by his own machine when one of his machines drove over him. But his legacy lived on quite admirably. The Box engines were actually quite successful.
So tell us a bit about your work and the stuff you show on the channel. What does it actually take behind the scenes to keep a 140-year-old piece of steam machinery in working order?
It's much like maintaining a helicopter. It's hours and hours of maintenance and preparation for 1 hour of operation, if you're doing it right. Typically in a year, to pull the machines out of layup, you actually take them out, check everything. Typically over the winter time, all of the drains and handholds on the boilers are removed, and we place large wicks in them to make sure that any accumulated moisture is drawn out, because the last thing you want is water sitting inside your boiler barrels. And we in-service the machines. Depending on whether they need inspections or not, we leave them apart for the inspectors to check them over. And then it's a matter of reassembling the machine, which for the winters that we have around here, that means reassembling a large amount of the piping, because we take all the globe valves apart and all of the ball valves. Anything that could potentially trap a little bit of water, we take apart, because when water freezes, it expands and it cracks things. So to properly take care of these engines, you have to properly lay them up, and that can take, a day or two at the end of the season and a few days to put them back together at the beginning. And to get them ready for shows, a lot of it is just getting the fuel together, getting the lubricant together, checking the machine over, making sure that nothing has loosened itself off, making sure that everything is properly adjusted, turning the engine over typically before the show, either on air or firing it up the day before, just to make sure that everything is in decent working order. And yeah, it's days of work for a single day of show.
That's incredible. Of course, back in the day, it would have been, operating almost continually, I guess. So
Yes. Yeah, typically back then, especially threshing crews, it was usually the job of a young kid to keep the fire going throughout the night. They would bank the fire down to just embers, and it was his job to stay up all night by lamplight and keep a little bit of steam on the gauge, so that as soon as sunrise hits, you were up and running, because you didn't have floodlights to work by. If the sun was up, you're working, and those things would work right through till sundown. That was the only way to do it.
wow, in the 1800s, time is money.
Absolutely.
So how many machines do you actively help restore and take care of at any one time?
Typically, I try to keep the number as low as possible, because then it's easier to keep track of where all the parts are sitting. Because if you've got a machine apart, sometimes we're working with machines that have little to no maintenance literature on them. So when you put them back together or take them apart, you have little to nothing to go by. So you have to keep track of every nut and bolt, where they go and how it goes back together and in what order. So for that reason, right now we have about 3 machines being actively worked on, and it's some of them, their disassembly goes back as far as 4 years. So you write that stuff down, because otherwise the memories get a little bit cloudy and you end up with a handful of bolts at the end of the project, and you don't know where they go. So
It's bad enough with my IKEA furniture.
yeah, absolutely. And some of them with threads that you've never seen before or since.
That's horrifying. Tell me why you think that running and maintaining these machines is important all this time later in 2026.
I think it's important that these machines not only be preserved, but they continue to run, because they kind of stand as monuments to generations that can no longer speak. And we get to show people the work of their hands. It's one thing to see a machine sitting in a museum under lights. It's another thing entirely to experience it as a living thing, especially when it comes to steam, because when you stand around these machines, they almost seem alive. They breathe air, they consume fuel. When they're not working, they make almost no sound at all. And yet when you put them to work, they shake the very earth that they stand upon. And that's the kind of engineering that was done back then. And the creativity for solving problems that these people of past generations had is really something that they get underappreciated for. When you actually see these things working and you see how things were solved mechanically without the use of software, without the use of electronics. Everything was mechanical and everything was done by hand. It's a testament to just the creativity of generations past. And I think that's why it's important to keep them running, because under glass, it's just not the same.
Is there something viewers at home who are interested in, aside from subscribing to your channel, obviously, can do to help out? Do you guys have like a donation link or something they can do?
Oh gosh, as it stands right now, we have one project with the restoration of a large Pioneer company tractor, actually, one of these ones right here. And right now the project is on hold, but if it gets going again, hopefully we will set up our online funding thing again, because there's only about a dozen of these Pioneer tractors left in the world, and only 3 or 4 of them run. And ours, the one that we have, is the lowest known serial number in existence. It's number 96 off the assembly line. And the long-term goal is to have a running tractor. Right now we're just looking to cosmetically restore it. We have most of the parts to do it. And hopefully, once we get the project up and going again, we have a online funding thing, because restoring it's not going to be cheap, because the few parts that are missing are going to have to be either remachined or recast using pieces that are taken off of other existing tractors to use as a pattern, because sadly none of the patterns exist, none of the blueprints exist. EM Wheelock did a pretty good job of making all of the literature on the tractor disappear. So we have little to nothing in the way of manuals to try to piece this thing together. So we're relying largely on the charity of other owners and other museums, what little they have. And yeah, hopefully someday soon we would have another running Pioneer, but that's the current project.
There's clearly a lot of crossover in the Oceanliner community between those obsessed and fascinated by steam engines in ships or rail or tractors, you name it. So it makes a lot of sense that you guys wanted to see a Tractor Designs video. So here it is. Thanks again to Rainhill for giving us this invaluable insight into this fascinating piece of history. Go ahead and give his YouTube channel a subscribe. Until next April Fools, I'm your friend Mike Brady, and this has been Tractor Designs.